In Kenya, corruption is a way of life for most people, from paying a small bribe to avoid a parking ticket to multi-million-dollar deals by corrupt businessmen and politicians. It's cost the country billions of dollars. And despite dozens of commissions of inquiries to investigate, no one can ever remember a high-ranking official going to jail. But a new constitution that's supposed to end impunity and create more transparency is giving people hope that things might change. Today, I'm talking to Kenyans from all walks of life about just how bad the problem is and whether it can ever be overcome. I'm Yvonne Dege, welcome to Nairobi and welcome to the Café. Joining us in the Café today are John Githongo, Kenya's best-known whistleblower who exposed graft and misrule at the highest levels of government, has returned to his country after years in exile. Alfie Omakwala, a law student at the University of Nairobi. He founded a youth football club to keep kids living in slums off the street. Wangui Mbatia leads a grassroots movement known as the People's Parliament. She brings Kenyans from all walks of life together to discuss their problems. James Shikwati, an economist and writer on public policy issues. He believes foreign aid breeds corruption. Eric Wainaina, a musician who shot to fame with his song Inchi wa Kitu Kidogo, meaning country of bribes. His anti-corruption anthem provoked changes in the government. Isis Nyong'o lived and worked in the United States. A former Google employee, she returned to her native Kenya to set up a business. And Mugo Kibati, a businessman who was appointed by the Kenyan government to head Vision 2030, the country's development blueprint that aims to transform the economy. Hello everyone, and thanks for joining me on the Café in Nairobi. John, I want to start this discussion with you. You really are the icon of Kenya's fight against corruption, and we're hearing so much about it in the news these days. Every newspaper you pick up talks about one corruption case after another. What's the temperature you're feeling on Kenya's fight against corruption? Are we getting anywhere?
I think what has happened, one has to keep in mind that in 2002, Kenyans voted overwhelmingly for a new government, largely on an anti-corruption ticket, but also promises have been made with regard to a new constitution, etc. The promise with regard to fighting corruption was not kept. So corruption in Kenya now is worse than at any time in Kenya's history. And that's if you look at the scientific polls that are conducted, whether they're subjective or the ones that are more quantitative. But the corruption has been decentralized and devolved. So people feel it a lot more. And that's what gives you that sense that corruption is a big problem. The contradiction in Kenya is that we have a very high level of corruption. At the same time, a relatively high level of economic growth at the same time. But it's economic growth that isn't producing any jobs. So inequalities are deepening.
And it sounds to me like what you're saying is that actually things are getting worse. I want to bring you in, Mugo, because there you are, you're the DG of Vision 2030. Listen to what John's saying here. Things aren't getting better. Do you agree?
Well, I agree with John to an extent that there is the decentralization, but there's been increasing transparency over the last 20 years. I am not so sure that we know all the scandals that existed in this country in the 70s and 80s when you had authoritarian regimes. So I think that in dealing with corruption, step number one is a transparency, and then the demand on accountability. Step number three, then comes the solutions, and those are more difficult to come by. That it was not going to be up to a couple of leaders who are part of the system anyway to deal with it. It had to be the people of Kenya to rise up. And I think there's no more clearer indication that the people of Kenya have risen up than the resounding endorsement to a very radical constitution that they gave last year, which begins to attack some of the structures, the judicial reforms and the police reforms.
On paper, that all sounds great, and we'll definitely come back to discussing the new constitution and what all of that means. But when you look at the raw statistics, it's a fact, it's known. Transparency International say that Kenya still ranks something like 154 out of 178 countries in terms of perceptions of corruption. I read somewhere that in an average month, a Kenyan has to pay something like 10 bribes just to get through the week or through the month. Alfie, share with us some of your experiences, because you're a university student, you're the next generation. Your generation are really going to try and obviously have an impact on what happens in this country. Do you buy what this person is saying?
I mean, the truth be told, from my generation, what Mugo is saying is just paperwork. From my side of the view is, I walk these streets, I encounter these people day to day. I'll give you an example. Before I wake up in the morning, there are no lights. KPLC is not to be found. There are no generators. When you wake up in the morning, there's no water. Why is the water company? There's so much corruption. If I'm going to town, I have to pay 70 shillings to get to town from Embakasi. That 70 shillings, I'd tell you, like 40 shillings out of the 70 accounts for Mungikis, the police, the business cartels. There's even a new cartel coming up. Since now the government cannot even have small matatus, they have stopped the limit. So what essentially is happening now is, if I have a matatu and I'm going to go for the business, I start tendering it around. If Wanaina wants the matatu, I'll give it to him. So you see, it's become a whole huge business. If I get to town, that the city council guy is following you up. You've passed the pavement, you've not even stepped on the pavement. The guy has come up to you. He knows I'm a young guy, I don't have the defenses. So he comes up to me and says, I saw you stepping on the pavement. It's 3,000 Kenya shillings. I have 500 shillings in my pocket. What do I do?
You've heard what Alfie said, Mugo. These ideas are great, right? But the day-to-day experiences of Kenyans is atrocious still.
Look, I agree with Alfie. The day-to-day experience of Kenyans are atrocious. I face the same. I would say that it's a little bit, a constitution is a little bit more than paper. And you're right. The impact of the new constitution is yet to bear fruit. I am confident going forward, Kenyans have begun to take their own destiny into their own hands. And going forward, out of the transparency and accountability and also checks and balances that come out of the new constitution, many of this will begin to be addressed. But that is down the road.
Maybe our sense of how bad the problem is actually overblown. Wangui, you spend your life trying to actually now track incidences of corruption. What is your take?
First, I work with people, ordinary citizens on the ground. So I am quite a bit aware of the actual impact of corruption. Besides the figures and the numbers that people throw around, there is a cost that Kenyans pay of corruption. Shortage of drugs in the hospitals. We did a survey just last year and we had a stock out of essential drugs. And I'm talking about very basic medicine that would assist a mother who has a child who has diarrhea, which is a preventable and curable disease, be able to make sure that the child doesn't die. That's missing in our hospitals. And you can attribute that directly to the money we lose on corruption. If you just follow what has been our news lately, literally every ministry is rocked with a scandal of proportions in the billions. Now, when you have those kind of figures, take for instance, right now we have drought and famine. And two ministries that would be able to address that are rocked in a crisis with corruption. You have the Ministry of Water and Irrigation that has lost billions of shillings that should have gone into irrigation to address our food shortages. We have the Ministry for Northern and Arid Lands that is right now in crisis because money has been misappropriated. And we don't look at corruption in terms of how it affects the people. So we end up with a population that is desperate for basic services. And not because the money is not available, but because the money that is supposed to go into those basic services gets misappropriated.
Wango, let me bring in James. James, give us some figures. I mean, how bad is it? I saw you nodding there. Tell us how bad the situation really is.
Actually, I'd like to give an analogy that whenever you walk in the streets and you pick somebody's pocket, the ordinary Kenyan will not let you go. They'll kill you. But when we get big guys involved in corruption, we call them honorable members. We respect them, we cheer them. So for me, I think this discussion about corruption, maybe we are missing something in the sense that there's a disconnect between what we call government and the people. Because if you look at the history, for example, the police system was set up to guard the colonial property. It was not set up to guard Kenyans. Now we have a government which I think has taken over that role. Instead of guarding Kenyans or addressing Kenyan interests, it guards these few guys who remained to serve the interests of themselves and the interests of their masters outside the country. So I think when we are talking about corruption, we need to look at that disconnect, which then fuels corruption in the sense that we would praise the big thieves, but ordinarily there's no Kenyan who will entertain corruption. That's why they kill people in the streets whenever they steal the money.
Eric, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I'm just thinking that Kenyans' needs are so basic right now, you know, and I think some of the times the discussion we have is very sort of at the self-actualization level, you know, where but right now people just want to know, can I afford unga for the day? Can I afford flour for the day? But sort of the dominant narrative, every day you wake up and you see people getting away with things daily, you know. I mean, if you look at reports, the Attorney General who's about to leave and the former head of Kenya Anti-Corruption Commission, Aaron Ringera, both of them didn't bring anyone to prosecution, you know.
Yeah.
And so as a Kenyan, you're sort of sitting there and you're thinking, what is it for if the people who are supposed to be safeguarding our country's vision are getting away with it, you know? And so the frustration that you mentioned when someone pickpockets you on the street, that person, when a mob acts on that person, that's them taking out the frustration that they can't access the people who they would like to access, you know? So
In 2003,
Go in.
in 2003, when the NAC government was elected into office, Kenyans did a remarkable thing. Actually, Kenyans took their own initiative to enforce anti-corruption laws. They actually would arrest people on the beat, policemen on the beat who are soliciting for bribes. That went on for about 3 months, and they stopped. You know why they stopped? There was no supportive system to support the initiative of the people to carry that to fruition. And when you have people who are constantly beaten down that way, in the same year, the government instituted a commission to interrogate one of the biggest scandals in corruption, the Golden Bank corruption, the Golden Bank Commission. And the one person we all thought was culpable was one Patni. And the government took the one guy we all knew was deeply involved, and they converted him into a state witness, meaning that at the end, the outcome of the commission is that he would not necessarily be one of the people who would be able to take to court, because they had converted him into state witness. The trouble in Kenya is that, one, corruption is deeply entrenched. It has stakeholders, it has interests, and they are everywhere. The corruption network is such that you cannot fight it because it's pervasive. You fight with the police, you meet with the judge in court, and the judge releases the policeman you got there. And the higher you go, the stronger the fight back.
I think Wangoi is raising a very interesting point here. Who owns this narrative about corruption? Is it Kenyans or is it foreigners? Because I think if it were Kenyans, I'd still go back to my point. They'll act against whoever is stealing. But as long as the narrative is not Kenyan, somebody else is paying others to talk about corruption, telling the government set up anti-corruption commission. You know, it's not Kenyans out of their own volition forcing the government to have anti-corruption. It's the donors who want to look good and show their taxpayers their money is not being stolen. So they tell the government, put up something that we can show our guys at home that there's something going on. So that narrative, as long as it's not about us talking about it, it is somebody else pointing to us that something is going on, we cannot feel it.
I think one of the things that need to happen is beginning to quantify the effects of corruption, you know, as in human rights terms, in human rights violation terms. The Kenya National Human Rights Commission and Transparency International did a report in 2002-2003 saying that the NAC government coming into power had spent $12 million on luxury cars, which now, okay, what does that mean? What it means is that they spent more on luxury cars than they did on money for malaria medication, right? So you begin, it's like maybe like the Holocaust Memorial, we need to put up a counter, you know, in the streets that just counts money, okay? And shows people, this is the money that you're losing, and this is what it could have been doing.
But if the situation is so bad, how do you explain the fact that people like yourself, Isis, American educated, raft of opportunities overseas, why do you come to a place like Kenya to do business when you can hear what John's saying, you can hear what Wangui is saying, just about how terrible the situation is? Why would you do that to